Masaya Nakamori, a man with a still and frozen gaze, enters a movie theater. Upon sitting down, he takes out an earplug, the special device to help him experience the movie. Masaya is visually impaired, and the voice coming from the earplug will serve as his sight for the duration of the film. Stepping back from the theater, we are introduced to another main character, Misako Ozaki. It is one sunny morning, and while on her way towards work, she is inclined to verbally describe everything around her. She is extremely attentive. She notices every small detail of the busy morning. The delightfulness of the weather, the restlessness of the office workers who are late, the movements and actions of people around her, shops and cars, and everything else finds verbalization in her mind. She wasn't always like this, though. This is a skill she's been honing for the most part of her life, and this is why she works at a studio that creates versions of movies suited for the visually impaired. Misako is the one writing descriptive texts and providing voiceovers so that sight-challenged people can also experience cinema. That day, she attends a focus group session aimed at perfecting her script. In front of a few blind participants, she reads out her descriptive script while a movie is playing in the background. Her language is poetic, and it conveys the pictures in quite a skilled manner. Listening to her voice gliding in the background of the film audio is a satisfactory activity in and of itself. The session is extremely interesting. The faces of the guests light up after hearing certain parts, and we see how they actively create the film inside their minds. Afterward, some put forward their helpful comments, underlying the parts that seemed a little vague. By the way, the man we saw in the opening scene, Masaya Nakamori, is also among the focus group participants, but he remains quiet and gloomy throughout the first part of the session. After the comments are made, Misako resumes reading her script. Subtle human emotions merge into captivating pictures of nature and symbolic representations of the past in her script. However, as she is speaking, we get a sense that she overdoes some parts in which human connection is painted. She goes into too much detail and expresses her own interpretation of the connection. After she's done, one woman expresses these concerns. She's extremely nice, choosing her words carefully so that she doesn't come across as rude. Soon, however, before she is finished with her point, Masaya raises his voice. He's not like any other participant. He scolds Misako openly for imposing her own interpretation on people who cannot experience art without her description. Thus, he accuses Misako of abusing her powers as a professional. Misako knows better than to argue. Besides, soon she understands why Mr. Masaya acts this gloomily. He is in the process of losing his eyesight. Compared to the others, all of this is new and emotional for him. During the evening, Misako is quietly looking at the sunset over the window when her friend, and a co-worker, Tomoko, brings her some tea. She knows what's on Misako's mind and is determined to rekindle her spirit. The job she's doing is a special one, and she must always remember that. At night, Misako rewrites some parts of her script when her fax machine starts rumbling and a letter comes out. It is from her mother, and she is asking if they can meet tomorrow. The next morning, Misako drives her small blue car through the dense and peaceful forest until she appears on a small slope and stops the car in front of her childhood house. It is an old Japanese building with a tile roof, open space, and lots of sun. Misako greets Misasaki, a lovely woman who takes care of Misako's mother. After their short, delectable conversation, we see the latter too. Her name is Yasuko, and she is visually impaired too. The mother and the daughter sit in front of the garden, and Misako realizes how perfect this place is. The house is encompassed by the sounds of nature, the blowing of the wind, the rustling of the trees, the chirping of the birds, and the creaking of the grasshoppers, and if Misako closes her eyes, she can hear them even better. This subtle moment between daughter and mother is peaceful and lovely. The next day, we learn a little more about Misako. As she holds her father's wallet, emptying it out bit by bit, we understand that this object holds enormous sentimental value for her. Her father is no longer around. Early next morning, Mr. Nakamura was sitting at his computer desk, working extensively. A dim light is coming in from his window when he calls his coworker in the office and asks him to send something over. The coworker happily agrees and says that he'll take care of it this morning. All of a sudden, Masaya gets confused and discomposed. Throughout this whole time, he's been thinking that it is still midnight. The light coming from the window is completely unnoticed by him. After the conversation, he takes his professional film camera, walks up to the window, throws away the curtains, and sighs his sorrow away. Out loud, he praises the great weather and feels relief. He can still see that the weather is great. But soon, the camera angle changes, and we look outside too. It is a dreadful, overcast day. He goes to his office then. His equipment is accommodated in his sight as much as possible, but still, the struggle is immeasurable. It is clearly getting harder and harder for Nakamori to be as productive as before. Going back to Misako, she is at a park, soundtracking her actions and her feelings as always. She is a narrator of her own life. Suddenly, Mr. Nakamura appears out of nowhere and sits himself on a bench. He takes out his camera, wins a film, and tries to take pictures of the kids. It isn't that difficult for him, considering that the kids, amazed by his camera, go to him themselves and pose in front of his lens without any invitation. Masaya fails to notice Misako sitting nearby, And there is no wonder his vision, as is shown to us briefly, appears to look like a photo film partially exposed to sunlight. After seeing this small scene, Misako's interest in Masaya doubles. Back in the office, she asks Tomoko about him and learns that Mr. Nakamori is a photographer, although he doesn't like to admit it. Tomoko has a book of his portfolio, and the photos he has taken over the course of his lifetime are truly magnificent. Misako falls in love with his work, so she asks Tomoko if she could take this book home for some time. Tomoko says she can have it for good, but only if she does something in return. Misako's phone rang suddenly then. On the other end of the line is the director of the movie they are currently working on. He wants to meet Misako the next day to discuss something important. We don't get to learn what Tomoko's request is until later that day, when Misako visits Mr. Nakamura. She's ringing the bell at his door when he comes up from the stairs. It seems he's just returning home. He doesn't notice Misako's presence until he gets close, and even then, he fails to recognize her. Misako greets him wholeheartedly then and tells him that she's here to give him a magnifier. Masaya is extremely grateful. He came out as a harsh man during the focus group session, but now he seems much more like a polite, kind-hearted man. He invites Misako in and offers her a cup of tea. His house is a little messy. The space is filled with sunlight, and the walls are overflowing with pictures. Looking around, Misako suddenly hears a crash and sees Nakamori struggling to prepare tea. By accident, he spilled some milk, and Misako helped him clear it out. It is obvious just how new this way of living is for Nakamori. He's not yet accustomed to living without proper sight. Misako notices a letter lying around. It is a wedding invitation, quite fancy and expensive, and a real prospect of a great experience. She decides that Mr. Nakamura either forgot about it or tried to but couldn't find it, so she hands it to him. But Masaya refuses to take it quite rudely. Here, a weird desire fills Misako, a desire to punch this man, so she uses his blindness and shadow boxes in front of him. This hilarious moment doesn't go completely unnoticed by Masaya. It even makes him laugh. A short time later, he starts preparing food. The ingredients are laid out quite impractically in his kitchen, so Misako offers to help. She teaches him how to arrange stuff properly, so that sight is not needed to find the necessary ingredients. After the food is prepared, the two move towards the living room. So far, this room is the most impressive to Misako. A ray of sinking sun comes inside the room and goes through an appropriately placed prism. Then it breaks into many colorful pieces, and as the prism rotates, the colorful orbs of light glide across the entire room. It is dazzling to see, and Misako decides to verbalize everything that she sees and feels. She's so good at it that a wide smile stretches across Mr. Nakamura's face. He can almost see. By some invisible thread, this moment brings them closer, and Masaya uses this opportunity to elaborate on the letter he refused to take. It seems that he was married long ago, and the invitation was for the wedding of his ex-wife. Only now does Misako start to notice the photos on the wall depicting one woman, and she realizes just how much sorrow and pain this man in front of her carries. Nakamori seems to hold on to and cherish this sorrow. The rest of the dinner passes silently, but the conversation that passed was enough for Misako to learn a lot about Masaya. That night, before going to bed, the latter falls into a sort of panic. Suddenly, he realizes that he can no longer see anything. Even his scarce eyesight seems to be gone for an instant, but a few seconds later, he realizes that it was just a brief moment of paranoia. He still has some light left in his eyes. When Misako meets the director, Kitabayashi, she finds him to be an extremely pleasant, wise old man. He has one suggestion about the script she has written. The character Juzo, who's clearly a projection of the director's own identity, expresses hope for the future in Misako's script. Through his own experiences, the director has found that as death got nearer and nearer, he got used to its inevitable presence, until he became somewhat indifferent in the face of it. The line between life and death is blurry to him now. He still has the desire to live as all humans will, but he has transcended the fear of death. This is why he wouldn't hope for brighter days to come. But after Misako tries to argue back, he realizes the beauty of her narration. It would be beautiful to transplant a seed of hope into Juzo's character. He says goodbye then and walks away in the pelting rain, raising no concern about the cool shower falling over his head. The focus group session is held in the next scene, in which Misako reads out the final minutes of the film. The story ends in an inspirational and sorrowful tone, and Misako does a great job of balancing her own subjectiveness. The comments are delightful afterwards. One of the participants expresses just how Misako's style developed over time and how she managed to create a thoroughly organized text. Masaya cannot help but argue against this, however. He brings up one of the scenes in which, from his perspective, the narrator did extremely poorly. Through transforming visual information into text, she destroyed the sense of space and made the story extremely flat and shallow. Especially after so much positive feedback, Misako doesn't feel the need to argue, so she answers that she'll work on that particular scene. Afterwards, one other participant comes up with an awfully delightful speech, expressing her gratitude towards Misako. To her, the film was about the beauty that is lost and may never be retrieved. It holds an enormous amount of sadness, but at the same time, thanks to Misako's wonderful narration, she was able to enter a world of cinema, and she's sure that watching the film directly couldn't have caused the same tide of emotions in her heart. Through Misako's words, she was able to grasp another, higher stage of cinema, and she's forever grateful. It is a shame that after this speech that understandably brings tears to Misako's eyes, Masaya decides to ruin the atmosphere by further complaining about the script. He says that the last scene wasn't elaborative enough and that he wasn't able to feel anything at all. Misako cannot help himself but to fight back now. Confident in the truth of her words, she tells Masaya that the main reason he couldn't enjoy the film like the other participants was a lack of imagination. A heavy silence falls, and Masaya, hurt by Misako's outburst, leaves the room quietly. Despite their differences, however, that evening, both Misako and Masaya were thinking about the same thing. The symbolic meaning that Misako puts into this is blurry to us, but looking over to the dusk, she begs the sun not to go. Masaya must be doing the same. A short time later, we see him hanging out with his photographer friends. He arrives at a bar alone and acts as if nothing dramatic is happening in his life. One of the friends handed him his latest work then. It seems like he worked on the cover of an extremely successful journal called Radiance. Nakamori holds the cover picture attentively, and even though he can hardly even notice what is in front of him, he tries his best to evaluate it. The friend group asks him about his vision, and all they receive from Masaya are short answers that overlook his real condition. This is exactly why they don't feel the need to help him on his way back home. And thus, Masaya walks the streets alone, trying his best to avoid hitting anything. But it is impossible to navigate with such vision, so he stumbles on the most disgusting part of the pavement. Covered entirely in some slimy substance, he is assisted by nobody, and all he can perceive is one of his cameras lying beside him. It is snatched away by someone then, and all Masaya can notice is the shoes of the thief. He has seen the exact same shoes today, and he knows exactly to whom they belong. He cleans his suit in a public restroom, then resumes his lone stroll around the busy streets. He visits his friend's workstation then. This is the same friend who showed him his cover piece earlier that day. Now we understand who the owners of those shoes were. The thief turned out to be Masaya's friend. In an outburst of anger and aggression, he takes him by the collar and takes his camera back. And the friend tries to deny having it stolen at first, but a tide of stinging remorse seems to come over him then, and he quietly hands it back. When Masaya exits the place, he sees Misako standing nearby, waiting for him. It seems she caught a glimpse of him in the crowded streets and decided to assist him on his way back home. And despite today's heated interaction, Masaya wordlessly accepts her assistance. While traveling by subway, he finally realizes that his vision is now completely gone. And as tears start falling from his eyes and he feels an enormous, uncontrollable thirst for warmth in this coldest and cruelest moment of his life, he grabs Misako's hand to tell her that he can no longer see. Later that night, while looking over to the empty space within the dark streets, he asks Misako to let him touch her face. After no longer being able to perceive the world through his eye vision, he is eager to see with the tips of his fingers, and the way he brushes his hands across Misako's face brings sadness to Misako too. In this unusual moment, the strangest bond is created. And now that Masaya has investigated the picture in front of him through his tactile receptors, he's confident that he can take his first photo after completely losing his vision. Misako remains quiet throughout this whole time, but when Masaya starts walking away quietly, she stops him and offers him something. While flicking through Masaya's pictures, one of them especially caught Misako's attention. It was a simple depiction of a sunset, but the picture held something extremely warm and intimate that spoke to Misako. Now she wants to go to that place with Masaya and watch that exact sunset with him. The offer is accepted. In the next scene, we see Misako watching the last minutes of Kitabayashi's film. The old man Juzo, played by the director himself, finds a memory of a person he loved long ago in his youth. A moment of letting go of youth and beauty is depicted, after which the main character continues his walk along a dune, transcending the fear of nearing the end. Weirdly enough, we get a sense that Juzo's counselor shares something with Masaya. That night, he receives a couple of tasks through voicemail from his work, none of which he can do. He also receives a message from Misako, asking him to watch the sunset this evening, and that he can answer. Approaching the dazzling view, the two share one sight, and upon arriving in the face of the setting sun, Misako's eyes immediately fill up with tears. Masaya's face is completely different. However, while Misako is in the process of chasing the sun, clinging to catch its rays, Masaya is already done chasing. This is why he's so much like Juzo. Catching the sun is no longer his priority, but he can still feel its presence and appreciate its warming effect. His heart used to creak back then, and now he cannot help but notice Misako's heart creaking too. With this analogy, the two hearts find an extremely intimate commonality, and Masaya, inspired by his own discovery, throws his camera away. He no longer wishes to cling to life's beautiful experiences. He just wants to experience them fully, and seeing him makes this discovery strum some deep strings inside Misako's heart. Suddenly, some overwhelming energy captivates her, and she gives Masaya a long and passionate kiss. And thus, the two hearts are forever linked. The next morning, Misako asks Tomoko to be given some extra time to revise the last minutes of the film. Without her consent, tears start falling from her eyes as she remembers the way Nakamori let go of the most important thing in his life. Based on yesterday's experience, she can see what Katabayashi meant by Juzo's finale. That night, while walking back home, she narrates her thoughts as usual. Trying to understand the perspective of sight-challenged people, she closes her eyes and, while feeling the road through her other senses, feels afraid. Masaya starts using a white cane that night, and after getting home, he burns all his negatives. The next morning, Misako receives a message through the fax machine from her mother's residence. That afternoon, she arrives there and sees a great commotion around the house. Rushingly, she approaches the entrance and is restlessly greeted by Misasaki. Soon, Misako learns that her mother ran away. She disappeared yesterday, as it seems, and is nowhere to be found. Immediately after hearing this, she dashes towards the woods and starts running through narrow trails. It seems as if she knows where she's going. But the terrain suddenly becomes extremely muddy, and it gets harder and harder for Misako to make her way into the dense forest with her simple shoes. Finally, she crosses this muddy area and starts ascending a slope, when suddenly, she hears the sound of a child calling for her father. Misako becomes afraid. The sound isn't coming from anywhere in particular. It is as if the forest is talking to her, reminding her of her own memories of her father. Misako's fear evaporates then, and she realizes where she's standing. In front of her is her father's tree. A great meaning is lurking in this memory, and after listening to the tree for a while, Misako continues her search. When she finally arrives near a ridge overlooking a great landscape, we realize that time has flown by in an instant. Misako must have lost all sense of time back there. But nonetheless, she sees her mother standing on the edge of the ridge, watching the sun go down. Their meeting is warm and sorrowful. Yasuko says that as the sun sinks behind the horizon, Misako's father will come back. This is why she walked this far, to be the first one to say hello to him. The memories of his dad start coming back to Misako again, and she's left feeling like a little girl again, resting in her father's arms and looking over at the magnificent sunset. The next day, after arriving at work, she found mail on her desk. Seeing who's it from is enough to increase her heart rate, and after opening the envelope, her pulse seems to drop to 0. Soon, we will see what it is too. It is the first picture that Masaya took after losing his vision completely. It's Misako's portrait, blurry and unprofessional looking. But despite its technical disadvantages, Misako's soul seems to emanate from this simple portrait. It is a great piece, and especially for Misako, it holds an enormous meaning. A movie theater starts filling up gradually in the next scene. Katabayashi's film is about to be shown on the big screen for the first time, and of course, Masaya and Misako are both here. And as the story of heartbreaking loss unfolds itself in front of many people, Misako remembers the night when she first saw Masaya walking with the help of a cane. The memory takes place on the day after their first kiss. We see Misako call out to Masaya. She offers him help to ascend the stairs, but Masaya is quick to decline this offer. He wants to do it by himself. Because it doesn't matter where she's standing, Masaya will always come to her. The final scene of Katabayashi's film flashes on the big screen then. After going through an enormous loss, Juzo lets go of the most beautiful thing in his life. He ascends a dune then comes in the face of a dazzling sunset. Masaya has a lot in common with this fictional character at this moment. After letting go of the most crucial thing in his life, he too is ready to keep on living and fight for things that are meaningful. And all thanks to Misako, who went through a series of life-changing events herself. Meaning it must be radioactive.